Got a story emailed to me yesterday afternoon. Here it is. My name is David, and for the last 20 years, I have worked as a physician's assistant, beginning in the U.S. Navy and working today for a private practice. I met my now ex-wife, Chris, while on vacation in Florida. We met sitting at a bar and struck up a conversation and finally exchanged phone numbers. Chris was living in Alabama at the time and was just out of high school. I was still in the U.S. Navy at the time and already had plans to stay in. I was still speaking to Chris at least 3 or 4 times a week over the phone. I was also seeing a civilian that worked for the Navy at the Norfolk Naval Base. I was at the time assigned to the main naval hospital at Portsmouth, Virginia. Gina was a great girl that I still sometimes think about. I guess you can call what happened to me with Chris as karma, because I hurt Gina, because of my attraction to Chris. Chris applied to transfer to Old Dominion University and was accepted. When Chris got to Norfolk, I broke it off with Gina. Gina was upset, but accepted the situation, and several years later, married another man and moved away from the area. Chris also got a job working in Virginia Beach to help pay for her room and board. Chris was a natural blonde with a slender body build. I know I should have not been so trusting. As I looked back at those times, I know I really made a bad mistake trusting her. About a year after Chris started school in Norfolk, my detailer sent me a message. I was being transferred from Portsmouth to Camp Lejeune in North Carolina. I stayed there for almost 2 years and was again transferred back to Portsmouth. I was close enough to Norfolk that I saw Chris about once every 6 weeks or so. One day while in Norfolk, I was sitting, having a meal in an open-air restaurant, when a sailor came up to me and told me Chris was cheating on me. I asked him, "How do you know this?" He scratched his head a bit and said, "Sir, I have no proof other than my word." I sure wished I had listened. I thought it was so silly. That evening with Chris, I did not even mention the conversation to her. When I got back to Portsmouth by this time, Chris was about to graduate. Chris was planning to teach school and already had a job lined up in the area. I decided to ask Chris to marry me. I borrowed one of her rings so I could get her ring size, right? Then bought a ring for her. Then one day I asked Chris to marry me, and she said, "Yes, David, I will be your wife." I was the happiest man in Virginia that next week. We got married soon after, and Chris already graduated. Started working as a high school teacher in the area. I worked at a bit of a weird schedule and never could be sure at the time I finally got off work. Then I could be home at 2 p.m. or as late as 9 p.m. Just depends on the workload. And if I was working in the ER, if I got home first, I cooked. If Chris got home first, she cooked and we both cleaned the kitchen. Then one day, about 6 months later, Chris told me she was pregnant. While Chris was pregnant, we made a nursery and I was so happy to be a father. Chris was just glowing then. For almost 4 months, I was able to be there when Chris was seeing her doctor. Then one day, Chris met me in the hall and asked me to not be present during the exam. This request was honored, but it felt funny. I remember walking back to where I worked and finally got my mind off that situation. That afternoon when I came home, I noticed Chris was not at home. No note and nothing that looked like dinner was being made. So, I made myself some dinner. I made a plate for Chris and covered it with tinfoil and placed it in the oven. After this, I sat in the living room, reading the paper and finally watched some TV. Still, no Chris. I decided to send her a short text, no reply. I gave it some thought, but realized if I started looking for Chris, she could come home and I would not know it. So, I said, okay, she is a big girl. I am going to bed. But I was mad as hell. When I got into bed that night, about 2 hours later, Chris came home. I was awake when she tried to be quiet as she got undressed. I flipped on the lamp and asked her, "Where did you go?" Chris angrily snapped back at me saying she would not be interrogated like a common criminal. After she got asleep, I quietly packed some clothes and slipped out of the house. I drove over to a hotel near the base and registered for a room. That next morning, Chris called me and apologized for what happened. I said, "We can talk about it tonight." I went back to work. I also did not go home that night. I went back to my room, turned my phone off. One of the duty nurses knew where I was staying and my room number, but was told not to tell anybody where I was. I did not enter the hospital normally through the lobby. Chris was sitting in the lobby, waiting on me. I see her as I walked close by. I went directly to my boss and asked him if I could take some time off. He said, "Take the day, but stay close by because I might need you. I did not say anything to Chris and left the hospital and returned home. I was on the couch taking a nap when I heard Chris pull up in the driveway. I was half expecting fire and brimstone, but Chris came in and said she was sorry. She spent that day alone, thinking about her life and being a soon-to-be mother. The only problem was the request to stay out of the exam room, followed by my ignored text that I later confirmed she got. I did not fully believe her. However, like the senpai was, I forgot about it all. And Chris, until her delivery, never asked me to stay out of the exams. By the time the baby was here, my parents were also here. My in-laws were staying with us, and my parents were staying in a hotel. My father is now a retired thoracic surgeon, and they were staying in one of the most expensive hotels in the Norfolk area. When Katie was born, I was just so glad it was all over. I was not paying all that close attention to the baby. Then about 20 or so minutes after the delivery, both sets of parents saw Katie for the first time. It was my father-in-law that first noticed something was not right. Then my father's face was white as a sheet. Katie was part Asian. My parents and I left the room. And by this time, my mother was in tears and my father was so angry. He could have chewed metal and spit it out. My parents said they had no interest in Katie, was glad she was healthy and left. To this day, they have never seen her again. I remember crying as I walked to a break room for a cup of coffee. I was there when Chris's dad found me. It's funny. You hear all these stories when men say their little girl can do no wrong. Not this man. He also got a cup of coffee, told me Chris's mom was looking after her. He told me directly, David, do not sign that birth certificate unless you are willing to be that little girl's father. I made sure the proper people were notified. I was not Katie's biological father. Chris's parents stayed near Chris that night, and about midnight returned back to my home. They had taken photos of the baby and asked me if they could use my PC to upload them. I said, yes. I then went to bed. I don't know which one it was, but one of Chris's parents told her to leave me alone that night. I did go up to her room that next morning. Chris was not in a good mood at all. I told her to wait on her parents to take her home. I was going back to work. I lied. I went that morning and rented a small storage unit and packed all my things. My parents helped me. By the time Chris got to the house, my stuff was gone. I never entered that house again. In the coming weeks, I decided I was getting out of the Navy. I applied for and was hired by one of the physicians that worked with my father. 6 months later, I was no longer in the U.S. Navy or Virginia. I hired a very good lady attorney who also had a good private investigator on retainer. In the coming months, I discovered everything there's to know about Chris's AP. He was a son of an Air Force fighter pilot and his Filipino wife. Brad was a cop that worked in the same area where Chris taught school. My father told me to talk to Chris and give her the divorce papers. Don't just have her served. So, I decided to see her at a place on the Norfolk Naval Base and gave her the papers. I advised her to hire an attorney. I also told her that within the next 30 days, I was no longer going to be in the U.S. Navy. She was going to lose all her military medical care and really needed to get her insurance from her job. As I was leaving, Chris grabbed my hand and was weeping as she asked me to sit down. First, she told me that she was not going to fight me on the divorce. She again apologized for not allowing me in that exam room that day. She was asking the doctor about a prenatal DNA test. Chris never said if she got one. My attorney was able to pull some strings and got me a hearing date so I could get out of Virginia quickly. I was out of the Navy by that time, and my parents were helping me out with housing until that hearing was finished. The day of the hearing came, and Chris brought Katie with her. Her parents were there as well. When the clerk called the case, I walked up to my place and Chris walked to hers. Our attorneys both were speaking to the judge. Here is where things go surreal for me. My attorney showed the judge photos of Katie and me. She also had the private investigator tell the judge what he discovered. The judge asked me if I was sure this is what I wanted. I said, yes. Then he turned to Chris and their attorney said, I had a history of being mentally abusive to Chris. I remember turning my head in her direction and mouthing the words, really, Chris? I looked back toward her parents and her father was shaking his head. Chris was asked by the judge to give him some examples of my mental abuse. She mumbled some things. Then the attorney said, because we were married at the time, I should be paying child support. My attorney and I both were caught off guard by this demand. My attorney mentioned some Virginia case law and the judge spent a few minutes looking at his computer screen. I was still looking at Chris at that time. The judge noticed this and told me to look at him. My attorney also added that there's DNA reports along with my case paperwork. Finally, the judge told Chris that under the circumstances, he can't award child support. He did tell Chris to get the biological father involved. We were renting a house. All my things were already in storage. Chris and I had about $1,500 worth of things from a local furniture store. I told the judge I would pay it off. My father sent a check several days later. Chris stayed in the house for about 2 years. Her AP dumped her out of spite. She told his wife and went after him for child support. Chris asked me several times to take her back. Every time I just ignored her. As I write this, I am looking at a recent photo of Katie. She will be starting the first grade this fall. I don't refer to her as my daughter, but I did speak to Chris's parents about her. Her parents were always great to me. They love that grandbaby as grandparents should. Her father told me as long as they are alive, Katie will be taken care of. Katie can't be blamed, because her mother is a thought. I am still single these days. I am also 100% MGDOW. Sometimes these days, when I think about that stunt Chris pulled in court, I break out in a cold sweat. I work hard, but I also play hard. I love to hunt and fish with my dad. There is one thing, though, that sticks out according to my father, because Chris and I were married.